Hello. In June this year, the critic John Carey wrote in the Sunday Times, "Reading these poems, you feel what the first readers of, say, Keats' Odes or Milton's 1645 collection must have felt, the peculiar excitement of watching a new masterwork emerge and take its permanent place in our literature." The book John Carey was reviewing was Seeing Things, the new collection by Seamus Heaney, which became an immediate bestseller, an astonishing achievement for a book of poetry. But Seamus Heaney is an astonishing poet. He was born in 1939 on a farm in County Derry in the north of Ireland, and much of his work begins in the farm landscape of his childhood. But his poems are far from being just celebrations of the countryside. There's a depth of thought and analysis that have led him to be appointed both Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory at Harvard University and Professor of Poetry at Oxford. Seeing Things, his new collection, marks a major change of direction in Heaney's work. Tony Knox's film explores how that change has its roots in the pressures of writing in a divided society during the troubled years since the publication of his first major collection called Death of a Naturalist. That was 25 years ago.
All year, the flax dam festered in the heart of the townland. Green and heavy-headed, flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. Daily it sweltered in the punishing sun. Bubbles gargled delicately. Blue bottles wove a strong gauze of sound around the smell. There were dragonflies, spotted butterflies. But best of all was the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water in the shade of the banks. Here, every spring, I would fill jampotfuls of the jellied specks to range on windowsills at home, on shelves at school, and wait and watch until the fattening dots burst into nimble swimming tadpoles. Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. You could tell the weather by frogs too, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in rain. Then, one hot day when fields were rank with cow dung in the grass, the angry frogs invaded the flax dam. I ducked through hedges to a coarse croaking that I hadn't heard before. The air was thick with a bass chorus. Right down the dam, gross-bellied frogs were cocked on sods. Their loose necks pulsed like sails. Some hopped. The slap and plop were obscene threats. Some sat poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. I sickened, turned, and ran. The great slime kings were gathered there for vengeance, and I knew that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it.
Even in Death of a Naturalist, the title poem of Seamus Heaney's first collection, there was a sense of danger in the countryside that reflected the troubled and divided community he'd grown up in.
I did grow up in a divided community that talked across its barriers very gently and intimately. I think of our own threshold at home. The negotiation for milk was a guy called Jim Gilmore used to come for the milk. There was just a kind of millimeter of difference between the courtesies at the door with him and somebody else. I mean, this is overstating it, even the millimeter.
Because he's a Protestant?
Yeah, that sense of difference was both acknowledged and it wasn't a barrier at that level at all, but it was. One was always aware of it. So yes, from the very beginning of my consciousness, almost there was a sense of the divided world. I mean, I wrote about it fairly directly in Death of a Naturalist, kind of heavy-handedly. It was a poem about set in Belfast, one of my few forays into the urban. But the folklore of the shipyards where hammers were dropped on Catholics, etc. In Wintering Out, I wrote about it directly insofar as it was about Protestant and Catholic neighbours, a poem called The Other Side, which is again about the crossing of that uses not a threshold but a river between two fields or a little stream. And it's the diction that's used in Northern Ireland, The Other Side. At the time of the Troubles broke out, actually, I just remembering the other day, I wrote a ballad called Craig's Dragoons, which was not printed. But, I mean, there are various ways in which, as Lowell says, one simply said, why not say what happened? One morning early, I met armoured cars in convoy, warbling along on powerful tires, all camouflaged with broken alder branches, and headphoned soldiers standing up in turrets. How long were they approaching down my roads as if they owned them? The whole country was sleeping. I had rights of way, fields, cattle in my keeping, tractors hitched to buckregs and open sheds, silos, chill gates, wet slates, the greens and reds of outhouse roofs. Whom should I run to tell among all of those with their back doors on the latch for the bringer of bad news, that small hour's visitant who by being expected might be kept distant, sowers of seed, erectors of headstones? Oh, charioteers, above your dormant guns, it stands here still, stands vibrant as you pass, the invisible, untoppled omphalos. I suppose I've always been, at the same time, aware that saying what happened is an angle of saying. The angle of saying is what's important. The angle of saying that that is expected, I suppose, in some ways, is that you join a political protest. Well, I did that with prose in the late 60s. I wrote in The Listener and places. There was plenty of exposure going on. And I don't think that the poetry functions particularly interestingly as exposure and accusation. As far as I was concerned, and as far as I still am concerned, the poetry is, and imaginative writing in general, is a way of reading, giving a sense of the world through a temperament, and you have to be true to your own temperament. And my temperament is not Brechtian. In fact, I have very little interest in politics in some part of myself.
In early collections like North and Wintering Out, you made discoveries about what you called cultural depth charges in the language and wrote about those. And as an example, if you will talk about a specific example, we could talk about the poem Toome. What is interesting you there particularly?
What Toome does is to go. It's just the name of a place on the borders between County Antrim and County Derry, on the River Bann. It's situated close to several Mesolithic sites where some of the first human habitation in Ulster occurred. It's got an eel fishery situated there. I think that I was wanting. This wasn't an intention, a program written out to myself, NB today, write about Toome and demonstrate the following. It wasn't like that. It was a sixth sense to say, look, citizens, there were creatures around the Bann here, around mid-Ulster, way back 6,000 BC. There's a kind of depth of habitation, relationship, belonging, to use a kind of corny word. There's more to us, to being here, than all this orange and green stuff. And the word tomb itself, the sound seemed to have that kind of old, not archaic, but archetypal invitation to dwell in it. My mouth holds round the soft blastings, tomb, tomb. As under the dislodged slab of the tongue, I push into a souterrain, prospecting what new in 100 centuries loam, flint, musket balls, fragmented ware, torques and fish bones, till I am sleeved in alluvial mud that shelves suddenly under bogwater and tributaries, and elvers tail my hair.
Did you slightly, or did you rather regret, or, no, better word, did you resent the pressure that was undoubtedly put on you and other poets in this part of the world, in Northern Ireland? Did you resent that, the expectation that was heavily delivered to you that, come on, you're poets, you're fine writers, you're in the middle of a serious and important situation, write about it?
I don't think we resented it, but we resisted it, perhaps too primly. The thing in the 60s and 70s would have been, generally speaking, let others come here and write about the melodrama of our troubles. They don't know it as well as we do. We know the inner complications. We know that it glamorizes it and melodramatizes it just to say it's about Catholics killing Protestants. What we knew was true, but maybe it was too refined. You know, maybe the times required something rougher. Whether or not that is true, the fact of the matter is that I think that writers in Northern Ireland behaved properly and honourably in not being enlisted into the ballyhoo of the thing. A number of them were involved in the civil rights. People went on marches. Prose was written. Programmes were, BBC discussion programmes were done. I think the writers behaved responsibly as citizens. They didn't behave in a mealy-mouthed fashion. As writers, they worked within the orthodoxies of the lyric as they had been working. Maybe the history of my own writing in the 70s, 80s, I mean, to inflate it, the history of my own writing in the 70s and 80s, but is a sort of a question mark over that resistance to obvious commitment. And yet, all the orthodoxies in some way are true. You mustn't become other people's mouthpiece.
In 1975, Seamus Heaney's cousin, Colm McCartney, was murdered by Protestants. Heaney wrote twice about the murder, once in an elegy and once in a long poem in which the spirit of his cousin criticises the poet for glossing over the ugliness of his death.
The first poem was an elegy, and traditional elegy resurrects the dead one in a benign landscape and makes the dead walk again in a beautiful, freed way. And that happens to some extent in the Strand at Lough Beg, where the boy's doom is mitigated by the gentleness of the landscape he comes from and his being reunited with that benign landscape. Across that strand of yours, the cattle graze up to their bellies in an early mist. And now they turn their unbewildered gaze to where we work our way through squeaking sedge, drowning in dew. Like a dull blade with its edge honed bright, Lough Beg half shines under the haze. I turn because the sweeping of your feet has stopped behind me, to find you on your knees with blood and roadside muck in your hair and eyes. Then kneel in front of you in brimming grass and gather up cold handfuls of the dew to wash you, cousin. I dab you clean with moss, fine as the drizzle out of a low cloud. I lift you under the arms and lay you flat. With rushes that shoot green again, I plait green scapulars to wear over your shroud.
there's a very strong passage in Station Island where he, as it were, comes back to haunt you and accuse you of confusing evasion with artistic tact, is one of his phrases. And the poet saccharined his death with morning dew. Now that seems to me to be a wonderful oppositional statements.
Station Island is a poem of self-accusation. It's a poem in which the mystifications of the art, the sweetness of lyric, is refused. It's a kind of sullen. I mean, I myself, as a writer, was sullen against lyric sweetness in it, and it kind of tries to put the boot in to lyric. But he had gone when I looked to meet his eyes, and hunkering instead there in his place was a bleeding, pale-faced boy plastered in mud. The red-hot pokers blazed a lovely red in Jerpoint the Sunday I was murdered, he said quietly. Now do you remember? You were there with poets when you got the word and stayed there with them, while your own flesh and blood was carted to Bellaghy from the fuse. They showed more agitation at the news than you did. But they were getting crisis first-hand, Colum. They had happened in on live sectarian assassination. I was dumb, encountering what was destined. And so I pleaded with my second cousin. I kept seeing a grey stretch of Lough Beg and the Strand empty at daybreak. I felt like the bottom of a dried-up lake. You saw that, and you wrote that, not the fact. You confused evasion and artistic tact. The Protestant who shot me through the head I accused directly, but indirectly you, who now atone perhaps upon this bed for the way you whitewashed ugliness and drew the lovely blinds of the Purgatorio and saccharined my death with morning dew. It's a dramatic poem as opposed to a lyric poem, and it tries to, and part of the drama of it in that case is contradiction of a previous part of
Is it contradiction of your own held beliefs or a different way of doing it?
It's an exploration. It's trying to open the fan of your beliefs. I mean, which are in this part of the fan or spectrum. There's a firmly held belief which says the function of the lyric poem is to tell the truth, and yet it's a poetic truth. The lyric poem admits the beautiful, the desired, the yearned for, therefore resurrect the dead in a benign landscape. That's one belief. The other belief or conviction is in the unliterary part of yourself, the kind of ignorant, thick-witted refuser of consolation part says, all baloney. You should simply record that this guy was probably shot by Protestant paramilitaries. We hear about the terrorism of the IRA all the time. You should go about insisting that it isn't just the IRA, that there are terrorists within the UDR and that they probably were dressed up, And you're caught between those two things. And in a way, the attempt, what we all make in our lives, one way or another, is to become one. And to not to be just a bundle of contradictions. The poetry is simply a way of trying to bring the contradictions together into one drama, one holding field.
Seamus Heaney's new collection, Seeing Things, marks a major change of direction. One key poem describes that change.
At school, I loved one picture's heavy greenness. Horizons rigged with windmills, arms and sails. The mill houses still outlines. Their in-placeness still more in place when mirrored in canals. I can't remember never having known the imminent hydraulics of a land of glaur and glit and floods at Delagon. my silting hope, my lowlands of the mind. Heaviness of being, and poetry sluggish in the doldrums of what happens. Me waiting until I was nearly 50 to credit marvels, like the tree clock of tin cans the tinkers made. So long for air to brighten, time to be dazzled, and the heart to lighten.
In your new collection, there's a key poem, Fosterling, where you describe a change from heaviness of being to a time to be dazzled, me waiting till I was nearly 50 to credit marvels. What's this change, if it is a real change, in your work?
I thought there had been a certain amount of wading deep in the heaviness with, there was a book called Station Island, where it was sort of confessional and penitential. And it was very directly in relation to the biographical experience of living through 20 years of Northern Ireland killing, people you'd know being killed, all the pressures about writers and politics, etc., etc. And it went through that at the time in the way I wanted to go through it, sullenly, without any lyric charm whatsoever, no lightness, all kind of barge work. I thought that book was a kind of a big container full of subject matter, among other things. And I mean, I think it's one of the laws or patterns, at any rate, of writing, that you want to do it differently. So there was a simple desire to change, and
Is that what you would describe in the lines, heaviness of being and poetry, sluggish in the doldrums of what happens?
That's right, sluggish in the doldrums of what happens. Behind that, there is this phrase which has been coasting around in some of the criticism I've done. It's a very attractive phrase from an old Irish story. The phrase is the music of what happens. It was, in short, Finn McCool's answer to a questioner who came from the shadows around the campfire and says, "Tell us, O Finn, what is the best music in the world?" And after various versions of that were offered, Finn said, "The best music in the world is the music of what happens." And you feel at times that, of course, is the responsibility of the writer to address, amplify, and analyze the music of what happens. But then, of course, there is the other music. There's the otherworldly music. There's the siren music, and there is the music of what might happen, the music of desire, and that's in the music of the wonder tales, I suppose.
And the crediting of marvels.
And the crediting of marvels. Yes, I think marvels. What I mean by crediting marvels is to kind of let the balloons go up and let desire go up, and let there be some kind of flag flown for spaciousness and pleasure. The annals say, when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayers inside the oratory, a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails. And then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. "This man cannot bear our life here and will drown," the abbot said, "unless we help him." So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvelous as he had known it.
"25 years after his first collection, Seamus Heaney is still, in this new book, writing about his boyhood in County Derry 40 years ago.
The first real grip I ever got on things was when I learned the art of pedalling by hand, a bike turned upside down, and drove its back wheel preternaturally fast. I loved the disappearance of the spokes, the way the space between the hub and rim hummed with transparency. If If you threw a potato into it, the hooped air spun mush and drizzle back into your face. If you touched it with a straw, the straw frittered. Something about the way those pedal treads worked very palpably at first against you, and then began to sweep your hand ahead into a new momentum. That all entered me like an access of free power, as if belief caught up and spun the objects of belief in an orbit coterminous with longing.
The poem Death of a Naturalist in the first collection is about a boy on the prowl around that area. And in this new, your first collection, and in this new collection, Wheels Within Wheels, is again about a boy prowling around this time. A boy about the same age. Mm-hmm. Now, would you say there was some distance between those two poems in the way of looking at that childhood through that boy? If so, what is it?
I think that in the later poem, the poem I just wrote a couple of years ago about the bicycle, looking back at that childhood, there is a greater comprehension of the distance. There's a greater acknowledgement of distance. There is a sense that this child is being invigilated at a distance with affection and some kind of comprehension. Whereas in Death of a Naturalist, one was much more up close, it was much more child's eye view, it was much more hot-breathed and close in. In cinematic terms, the Death of a Naturalist is a close-up, whereas this one is, the other poems are in long shot. I think long shots give you an airier view. They give you a greater sense of comprehending the littleness of the creature in the largeness of the territory.
Both of Seamus Heaney's parents have died in recent years. His father died during the preparation of this new collection. There are poems in this new collection about your father, which I find very moving, very strong. There's a sense of grieving in them. There's a sense of deep love and admiring. Was he the sort of man? He obviously was the sort of man. Did he have an enormous effect on you, which you are now discovering?
There was a potency and distance in our relation. And he was almost always an archetype to me, rather than a parent, if you know what I mean. After about
those great sayings that he came back.
Yeah, well, the sayings were few, therefore they were cherished, I suppose, and they were shared by the family. So he had that. I suppose one element that should be mentioned is the number of. There are 8 of us, and the mythologizing of statements by the parent and his kind of intelligent put-downs. He was devoted to reducing the magnified as far as possible. So I suppose in some kind of way we're completely overwhelmed by him. Yeah. Catch the old one first. My father's joke was also old and heavy and predictable. Then the young ones will all follow, and Bob's your uncle. On slow, bright river evenings, the sweet time made him afraid we'd take too much for granted, and so our spirits must be lightly checked. Blessed be down to earth. Blessed be highs. Blessed be the detachment of dumb love in that broad-backed, low-set man who feared death all his life, but now and then could make a splash, like the salmon he said was as big as a wee pork pig by the sound of it. In earshot of the pool where the salmon jumped, back through its own unheard concentric sound waves, a mower leans forever on his scythe. He has mown himself to the centre of the field and stands in a final perfect ring of sunlit stubble. Go and tell your father, the mower says. He said it to my father, who told me, I have it mowed as clean as a new sixpence. My father is a barefoot boy with news, running at eye level with weeds and stooks on the afternoon of his own father's death. The open black half of the half door waits. I feel much heat and hurry in the air. I feel his legs and quick heels far away, and strange as my own, when he will piggyback me at a great height, light-headed and thin-boned, like a witless elder rescued from the fire.
There was just a whole series of literary and life events, I mean the death of parents obviously, where the sense of crossing from one state to another, the sense of the threshold experience, the sense of the rite of passage, whatever, was coming to be a very useful and inevitable, not useful, but just those terms began to be the equivalent of what I was experiencing in my life. So I got started on this little series of poems, and I got the idea of a crossing, just crossings. So doorways, latches, and so on began to figure, and they figured both for themselves and for their metaphorical possibilities. Running water never disappointed. Crossing water always furthered something. Stepping stones were stations of the soul. A kesh could mean the track some called a causey, raised above the wetness of the bog, or the causey where it bridged old drains and streams. It steadies me to tell these things. Also, I cannot mention Keshes or the ford without my father's shade appearing to me on a path towards sunset, eyeing spades and clothes that turf cutters stowed perhaps, or souls cast off, before they crossed the log that spans the burn.
Why did you call this collection Seeing Things?
I called it Seeing Things because it came to me. I wrote the poem about crossing over to Inishbofin, which is a boat journey that was shadowed by another boat in the book, the boat at Clonmacnoise that appears in the air. And when I did the little Clonmacnoise thing, fear of water's in it, my own fear of anxiety about drowning, and then up came this memory of my father almost drowning, and the poem was about seeing him, and all of a sudden the term just came, Seeing Things, and it seemed to me completely right for the book. I knew the book was going to be maybe called Lightnings. I had that at the back of my head, but I felt Lightnings was a kind of dangerous title. And it seems so simple, so throwaway, and so potentially visionary at the same time, that I liked it.
When you're talking about this crossing to Inishbofin, are you drawing on a particular crossing that you made, or particular crossings that you made?
I had one particular crossing to Inishbofin in the 70s. We went across on a Galway hooker, myself and a family. A great, it's kind of sailboat. It's like a first journey. It's like going to sea in a story, open to the air and the waves and so on. The hooker, as I recollect, was anchored a little bit out from the pier. And we went from the boat to the pier in a rowboat. And that was actually, to me, a terrifying moment because it was, as the poem describes, clear water, stillness, but the boat was sunk to the gunwale and you felt one false move and we were out.
Inishbofin on a Sunday morning. Sunlight, turf smoke, seagulls, boat slip, diesel. One by one, we were being handed down into a boat that dipped and shilly-shallied scarsomely every time. We sat tight on short cross benches in nervous twos and threes, obedient, newly close, nobody speaking except the boatmen, as the gunwales sank and seemed they might ship water any minute. The sea was very calm, but even so, when the engine kicked and our ferryman swayed for balance, reaching for the tiller, I panicked at the shiftiness and heft of the craft itself. What guaranteed us that quick response and buoyancy and swim kept me in agony. All the time, as we went sailing evenly across the deep, still, seeable down into water, it was as if I looked from another boat sailing through air far up and could see how riskily we fared into the morning and loved in vain our bare, bowed, numbered heads.
In this new collection, Seeing Things, I'd like to talk about two poems, Markings and Field of Vision. And they explore crossings of visions, ways of seeing, thresholds and borders. And what would you say that you're after in these two poems? Should we talk about them one at a time?
Yeah. Right.
What do you say you're after in Markings, which is apparently very simple, but it's very emphatic poem. I mean, that these things are very important.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you doing there?
Well, the poem was after me in a way. I don't know, I discovered where it was going. I did have one firm notion when I started to write it, and that was that I wanted to address the mini miracle of children being able to see in the dark when they're playing games. They're playing football. So they cross a line. They cross from the usual sight to the kind of inner light, if you like. And this isn't a mystified thing, this is an observable thing, and we all remember it. And it seemed to me that this was a metaphor for the possibilities that reside in writing and in artistic activity generally, in music even, that you are amplified, extended, and so on. There's a little play in the poem on the phrase extra time, which is a football term, but it's extra in the sense of being outside time, the timeless moment, the sense of time stopping. That I wanted to get to that, and then it goes into really memory in general, about what happens when the remembered is held up and becomes transfigured in memory. It says somewhere in the poem that these things entered you as if you were the door, and what came through it. They marked time.
Marked the spot.
Marked the spot.
Marked time.
Marked time and held it open. I suppose that's a description of what I would like to be able to do also with a poem, that it be not just pictorial, that it be not just a documentary representation, but that it have an aura and a radiance and a sense of fullness and presence, and that it marked time.
We marked the pitch. 4 jackets for 4 goalposts. That was all. The corners and the squares were there like longitude and latitude under the bumpy ground, to be agreed about or disagreed about when the time came.
Declan, Martin, Aidan.
And then we picked the teams and crossed the line our called names drew between us.
Gareth, Mark. Forward. Back. Forward. Midfield.
Youngsters shouting their heads off in a field as the light died, and they kept on playing, because by then they were playing in their heads, and the actual kicked ball came to them like a dream heaviness, and their own hard breathing in the dark and skids on grass sounded like effort in another world. It was quick and constant, a game that never need be played out. Some limit had been passed. There was fleetness, furtherance, untiredness, in time that was extra, unforeseen, and free.
In this new collection, Seeing Things, as we said at the beginning when we were talking about the poem Fosterling, you seem to be reaching occasionally, after you seem to be saying something which is a new or a transfigured vision. In your own words, there's anglings, aimings, feints, and squints. And there's looking for a particular moment, as you've talked about extra time, there's a timelessness, there's a sense of being given extra and that sort of thing. Can you just talk about that in relation to the poem, first of all, The Pulse?
The Pulse is rejoicing in the sense of completely unlimited freedom, the sense of angelic possibility. It's about the sweep of a line going out off a spinning reel and the airiness of it. And it is... it's in tune with the desire to credit marvels and to get away from the heaviness of being. But actually, like Oisin and Tiernan Og, you tire of that. I mean, you're half angel, but you're half beast. And the poem acknowledges then the second complementary and finally satisfactory, most satisfactory thing after the airiness of this is to get the sense of being in touch delicately with the river. It's about the way a rod tip and a line links into the current of the river, and the way in which all that is sensed at the butt of the rod and in your hands and in yourself and into your very heel, so that you're part of the current of energy, if you like, of the world itself. You aren't up in the air. You aren't under the earth. You are a live wire, as it were, and you feel that thrum of the river, which is like the axle hum of the earth itself. So you're both planetary and full of possibility. You know, it's again, it's about a sensation, but trying to transfer the sensation, the physical sensation, into a meaning that is beyond just the physical.
The effortlessness of a spinning reel. One quick flick of the wrist, and your minnow sped away, whispering and silky and nimbly laden. It seemed to be all rise and shine, the very opposite of uphill going. It was pure duration, and when it ended, the pulse of the cast line entering water was smaller in your hand than the remembered heartbeat of a bird. Then, after all of that runaway give, you were glad when you reeled in and found yourself strung, heel tip to rod tip, into the river's steady perches and thrum.
In this new collection, there's one poem. Well, I'd like to talk about one poem where, as it were, your older, more expected elements and the newer ones seem to come together in deserted harbour stillness, where it seems to be exemplified that the terrestrial grasp and the airy aspiration, whatever it is, are together there.
I find it hard to comment on these serially, as it were, because it is precisely the sense of fullness and equivalence, the sense that the harbour water and the brimming aspect of things that is in the harbour matches the outer and the inner are in equilibrium. It's a notation. It's meant to be both physically exact and metaphorically potent, and and the physical and the metaphorical are to do with fullness, brimming, and clarity, a sense of plenitude and a sense of arrival, a sense of beatitude, actually, which is always momentary and in passing. It isn't something that you're going to promise forever. It's something that is momentary. And I think the poem is about that fullness, momentariness, and but at the same time, beatitude of being.
Deserted harbour stillness. Every stone clarified and dormant under water. The harbour wall a masonry of silence. Fullness, shimmer, laden high Atlantic, the moorings barely stirred in. Very slight clucking of the swell against boat boards. Perfected vision. Cockle minarets consigned down there with green slick bottle glass, shell debris, and a reddened bud of sandstone. Air and ocean known as antecedents of each other, in opposition with omnipresence, equilibrium, brim.
In this new collection, one of the poems I found most interesting and most, when I say difficult, I don't mean it's difficult to understand, but difficult. It begins, not an avenue and not a bower. Now, it seems to me you're trying there to talk about what can't be talked about.
Maybe so. It's about one particular place again. It's on North Antrim in the road. You can see this little archway of trees, a more tunnel of trees, as you come up to it. It's a bare landscape. As I recollect, they're Scotch firs, but there's kind of tuftedness. And you drive up to them and you go through them and you're out the other side. I've always found something extremely gratifying and happy about going through the trees. So I was writing these little 12-line things, and the idea of crossings was in my mind. And this was one of the just little transitions, threshold thing, straight through. Once again, it has a definite phenomenological meaning, but how do you make sense of it? And in the poem, the poem just tries to catch the sense of speed, the sense of almost being like a hare or a rabbit skimming through a thing.
Not an avenue and not a bower. For a quarter of a mile or so, where the county road is running straight across North Antrim Bog, tall old fir trees line it on both sides. Scotch firs, that is. Calligraphic shocks, bushed and tufted in prevailing winds. You drive into a meaning made of trees, or not exactly trees. It is a sense of running through and under without let, of glimpse and dapple, a life all trace and skim the car has vanished out of, a fanned nape, sensitive to the millionth of a flicker.
But fundamentally, these glosses on these little poems are difficult because the poems themselves are glosses, and they are precisely meant to elude the kind of explication which one obligingly gives. They are meant to say, I'm not going to be obedient to the P's and Q's of joined up prose. We're going to try and be a poet for a change.